My name is Rustlin, and I'm almost 60 years old, living in Brighton Beach here in Brooklyn. Now, I listen to your podcast a lot when I drive my cab, which is all I do, all day, every day pretty much, just driving my cab. But things never used to be this way. You see, I emigrated to the United States in 1992, a short while after my country disappeared overnight. But before that, I was a forest ranger in central Russia, where Europe meets Asia, in a place called Yugidva. Now, the Yugidva National Park is spread across the western slopes of Russia's Ural Mountains, which was about 1,600 kilometers east of Moscow. Now, there is a tundra at the highest elevations, while meadows cover the lower, but more than half of the park is covered in boreal forest of pine and spruce. At almost 19,000 square kilometers, it is a very big place. And to put that into perspective for you, the entire landmass of Kuwait is only 17,000 square kilometers, meaning the park is even bigger than some entire countries. Seeing as it's in quite a remote location, there are other parks with much easier reach of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The park received relatively low levels of tourism, with only a few thousand people visiting each year. Seeing as it's in quite a remote location, there are other parks with much easier reach of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the park received relatively low levels of tourism, with only a few thousand people visiting each year. Now, back when I worked there, those visitors were often the families of Red Army soldiers stationed at nearby bases, as it was an encounter with one such soldier in 1987 that marked the beginning of the events that I'm about to share with you. My official title while working for the park was Lishnik, which loosely translates to forester. Now, we don't have rangers, and I find this a very American concept. We were not offered fancy titles under socialism, and we did not require them to do our jobs. We were foresters, one and all, and that's what I responded to when I heard it barked at me from down a trail one day. It was high summer, the busiest time of the year in terms of tourism, and I was walking along a woodland trail when I suddenly heard someone shouting from behind me, "You there, Forrester, come here now." Now, in that moment, I turned to see a man out of uniform, but I could tell just from the way he addressed me that he was an officer in the Red Army. I had served a few years in the Army myself when I was a much younger man, enough to know its officers shared the same collective personality, that which my American neighbors called jerk-offs. I like this word, and it almost sounds like a Russian word. And as he marched towards me, quick and angry, I turned to face him. Now, behind him stood his family, a wife and two young children, a boy and a girl. But unlike the officer, who appeared furious, all three of his family looked very shaken, like they had seen something which frightened them deeply. Now, when I asked the officer what the problem was, he exploded. He told me some strange person was wandering around the forest, and that this man had deliberately set about to intimidate his wife and children as they sat down for a picnic. I asked for a description of the man, and the officer described him as being tall, dressed in dark furs, and wearing a hat that appeared to have been made from a bear's head. Now, at first, he didn't outwardly threaten the family. He just simply watched them from a distance and opted for a silent staring contest when challenged by the officer. But then, when the officer took a few steps in his direction, the man wearing the bear's head began to charge at them. The officer said his children began to scream, and he believed he was going to have to fight the man to protect them. Yet just in the style of the beast which sat atop his head, it was a false charge, and after having scared the officer's wife so terribly that she was crying, he stopped and then walked off laughing at the terror he'd sown. Now, to me, it sounded like a hunter who drunk too much vodka, but when I suggested that, the officer made it clear that the man was no hunter. He carried no visible weapon. All he had was madness in his eyes. Now, he also suggested that I find him and fast, because if the man wasn't apprehended by the end of the following week, there'd be hell to pay. So later that day, myself and one of my fellow foresters got to work trying to find the so-called crazy man who wore a bear's head for a hat. Now, we had an old UAZ 469 back at Central Headquarters, one which we nicknamed the Goat. It was loud, the brakes were lousy, and riding in it for long distances put bruises on your butt. So, not necessarily the greatest of all time, like my friend's kid says about the Dagestani fighter. The goat wasn't gentle, but it was reliable, and it was easy to repair. And then with so much ground to cover to do our jobs, we loved it like the Huns loved their horses. We drove out to where the officer had spotted the man wearing the bear's head, and then we went walking around the woods for hours, looking for tracks or leftovers from campfires or animal butchery. Now, the park used to get a great deal of illegal hunting, especially during the autumn months, which certain poorer families wanted to stock up their larders for the long Russian winters that I do not miss. And since the park was so big, these hunters sometimes spent days at a time living off the land while tracking down larger animals to bring home. All that activity makes them easy to track. But to our surprise, and aside from a few useless tracks that led into streams or onto hard ground, there was no sign of the bear man anywhere. Now, we decided to finish our search, as sunset was fast approaching, but since I most definitely believed the officer when he said he'd bring trouble for us if we didn't find him, we just resumed our search for the bear man the next morning, bright and early at dawn. Now, myself and a coworker headed further into the wilderness, leading on from what we believed were likely to be the bear man's tracks, but we couldn't know for certain. We crossed a few miles of meadows and streams, keeping our eyes on the ground for any sign of our bear man, but all we found were animal tracks, a few droppings, but nothing human. The man had no doubt gone deeper into the park, in which case we were traveling in the right direction, so to not find a single sign of him beyond what we'd already found was deeply unsettling. And after a while, myself and my partner started to believe that going any further was a waste of time. If we hadn't found any trace of the man, then we were in the wrong area. But then, right as we were about to turn back and return the goat to HQ, we found the charms. Now, I don't know if charms is the right word here, but the word in Russian is obereg, and it means like trinkets that have a holy or spiritual power to them. Some are related to the church and consists of lengths of blessed rope that some tie around the necks of their dogs, but others are related to zagovori, or Slavic folk conjuring, and do not bring blessings, but only curses. And so, as you can imagine, it was a very unpleasant surprise to find that the ones we discovered that day were almost certainly of the second variety. The first one we found was hanging from a low branch and consisted of a small bird's skull with a backboard of woven twigs. Now, my partner pulled it from the tree and gave me a look. Such things were not strictly legal during communism. Zagovori wasn't against the law, but a man could expect some extensive psychiatric treatment, quote-unquote, if he was found to have faith in such ancient superstitions. We didn't take this as an indication that our bear man was a crazy person worshipping the old gods, but we certainly took it as a sign that he wasn't interested in respecting our authority as foresters. Now, having realized that we were closer than we first thought, we decided to push on into the forest. Then only after a short distance, we found more of what we could only assume was the bear man's charms. Not all of them included animal bones, only the most disturbing ones. But each and every one let us know that we were in this man's territory, some place he did not want us to be. There was still the question of if this man actually made the charms, but we had to assume it was him because the idea of 2 or more people running around with furs while making charms, that was just too unsettling for us to consider just yet. And since we had his territory roughly marked out, myself and my partner returned to HQ to report what we'd found. Now, our boss told us that he'd organize a wider search with a larger team for the next morning. And at dawn, we hiked alone to cover more ground, using radios to keep in touch with each other. But this proved to be a big mistake. At around mid-morning, one of our team was walking through the area that we'd explored the day before when suddenly, the very ground beneath his feet seemed to give way. At a pure instinct, the forester turned as he fell and tried as best as he could to propel himself away from the drop. This meant that he was able to hang on, but only barely before he used all of his might to drag himself to safety. Now, once he'd managed to find his feet, he turned around to inspect what he'd almost fallen into. And that's when he discovered a deep pit full of sharpened stakes. and there were 6 in total, and each was sharp enough to puncture a man's boot, should he have fallen with enough force. And since he was safe to do so, the team member called in what he'd found over his radio, and we all went rushing over to his position to check it out. And only then did we realize how serious the situation was. This bear man didn't simply mean to mark out his forest fiefdom. He was determined to wound or potentially even kill anyone who pursued him. And since we were not armed at the time, we retreated to our various HQs, either northern, central, or southern, and awaited further orders from our boss. Now, we were itching to find the man and have the police arrest him for almost snuffing out one of our team. And then when the time finally came to strike back, it came with fantastic news. The next time we went out looking for the bear man, we were told that we'd be equipped with rifles loaned from the local Red Army militia, like your Army Reserves kind of thing. And we were also ordered to travel in teams of 2 for safety, which was also music to our ears. And we thought this could keep us safe and that the sight of us with weapons might scare this bear man away, but we were wrong. Dead wrong. And just a few hours into the search, we received a frantic call over our radios from one of the 2-man teams. The caller sounded terrified as he explained that they were under attack from an unknown position. They couldn't see the attacker, but their attacker could see them, meaning they'd been forced to fall back at a rapid pace to avoid being hurt or killed. Now, we hadn't heard any gunfire, which was obviously very strange if these 2 men were under fire, but we also knew which sector the pair had been assigned, so we went running in their direction with our rifles ready. Now, we expected to hear gunfire on our approach, but we didn't. We only heard the sound of our 2 frightened coworkers running for their lives and yelling for us to help them. When they saw us, they began shouting about how he was behind them, and then they frantically began urging us to rake the area behind them with bullets because he was there, we just couldn't see him. They had clearly not been spooked by anything imaginary. Someone had most definitely given them a fight, but to us, it looked like they were running from ghosts. Now, the 2 men refused to come out of cover for a minute or 2, saying that there had been arrows flying at us any second. Now, this is the point where we all asked them, "Arrows? Are you sure?" But we didn't need to take their word for it because after carefully retracing their steps, we found one of the arrows that had been shot at them buried in the trunk of a tree. Now, that incident with the arrows marked the end of our forester patrols. The boss refused to allow us to return to that area of the forest without a militia escort, the militia being the Soviet militarized police force here. They could bring their Kalashnikov and PKM machine guns with them, all fully automatic, unlike the SK rifles we used, which dated back to the Great Patriotic War. And a week later, and once they had assembled, we guided the 24-strong militia unit towards the bear man's territory, and then we hiked up and down the forest all day long in search of him. Seeing as we were a larger force, we were able to cover much more ground, but no arrows or bullets were fired, and we failed to discover the man's living arrangements. We thought that since we didn't encounter him a second time, the bear man had most probably moved on, and this made a lot of sense to us as he'd seen us walking through his woods with rifles just a week or so prior. If the man really was confined to a simple bow and arrow, then we had him sorely outgunned, and it only made sense for him to flee while he still had his luck. But the man had not moved on. On the contrary, he simply waited to strike on his own terms. About a week after the militia helped us sweep the forest, 2 foresters staying in a northern sector cabin received a very frightening surprise in the middle of the night when they discovered that someone had snuck up to their cabin and set it on fire. Luckily, one of the foresters was awake and heard the glass bottle smash on the wood outside before the sudden burst of flames sent him rushing for the fire extinguisher. He tried his very best to douse the flames, but those old Soviet military fire extinguishers that we had were next to useless, and he was unable to put out the fire. Both foresters managed to escape the burning cabin with their lives, but the incident marked a further escalation in this conflict. Instead of us going hunting for him, this bear man was now hunting us. And the boss had called the militia back into the forest, only that time they arrived with more than twice the numbers. Instead of just 24 men, they sent an entire company of militarized police to comb the bear man's territory, and that time He didn't simply watch and wait for the policeman to corner him. He attacked. Chaos erupted around midday when one of the militia officers was shot with an arrow. Thankfully, it only punched through the meat of his shoulder and did not penetrate any internal organs. But we all heard the man's screams of agony echoing around the forest before a storm of gunfire commenced. The men accompanying the wounded officer opened fire into the woods, shooting everywhere and anywhere in the hopes of hitting their hidden attacker. When they finished, no more arrows came after their storm of gunfire, and following a search of the area, blood trails were found leading deeper into the forest. The militia tracked these blood trails with dogs, and after hours of marching deep into the woods, they finally found one of the man's living spaces, consisting of little more than a dugout that used pine branches for shelter. The blood trails had ceased long before then, presumably after the bear man tended to his wounds, but despite there being ample evidence of him residing there, he was nowhere to be found around his improvised living space. Now, that final militia patrol marked the end of our encounters with the bear man. There were no more arrows fired, no more charms found, not for a long time anyway. We thought the man had either succumbed to his wounds or decided to vacate the area entirely. And either way, we had dealt with a problem that could have easily resulted in one of us losing their lives, and so as you can imagine, we were very relieved to be able to focus on our jobs again. Now at this point, years have passed, and the Iron Curtain fell, and overnight we found that we didn't have jobs to even do anymore. Some had stuck around living off the land and off what little our old money could buy us, but then slowly and surely, one by one, foresters started leaving. Some for Moscow or Perm to find work, and others to foreign countries where they'd hope to start a new life. I ended up being one of those men who left Russia for good, but during that process of getting a visa, packing up my things, and saying goodbye to family, I often wondered if I was doing the right thing or not. But do you know what happened to make me realize that I was doing the right thing? It was when I heard from an old coworker, still living in and working in Yugoslavia, that on a routine tree count, another one of the bear man's charms had been found. Only this one looked brand new. And I've never looked back, not because I don't miss Russia, which I do a lot sometimes. It's because there was never just one wild man wearing his bear's head, hoping to kill or wound foresters. There were more, perhaps even a lot more. And it felt like it was only a matter of time before that same bloody struggle played out, all over again. My name is Ion, and I'm a forester here in Romania. I lived in a small village very close to the forest, and every morning after waking up early, I put on my uniform and I head out into the forest. And my job is really quite simple. Just like my colleagues, I walk many kilometers every day to check the trees. We mark old or sick ones to be cut legally, and then we count the number of young trees and plant new ones in the spring. Now, we keep our eyes peeled for bears and wolves or lynx, because they too must be monitored and counted just like the trees. But one of our most common activities is stopping cars and trucks to check their papers and check for illegal wood. Because without a doubt, the single biggest problem that we have here is illegal logging. Now, they mostly come at night with axes and chainsaws, and then cut down the best and oldest trees, either beech, oak, or spruce, and then haul them away as fast as they can. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how many trees can these people cut down? It can't be many. Well, sometimes the larger gangs can cut down to 100 trees per night, and they do this night after night, taking very few nights off, so in that space of about a month, we can lose thousands upon thousands of healthy, old-growth trees. Now, many of the foresters, the less reputable ones, take bribes from the loggers. The rest of us are intimidated with their axe and chainsaws, and sometimes they even carry guns, something we ourselves were not allowed to carry until 2019, at which point it was too late to stop this story's events from unfolding. Illegal logging is very damaging to the forest, and not just in the ways that you might assume. Without the trees, the soil washes away when it rains. This muddies rivers, causes them to burst their banks, and they flood villages to cause devastating and sometimes lasting damage to people's lives. Logging also frightens the animals who either flee their habitats or are killed as their nests or dens come crashing down or are crushed by those same falling trees. And I fear that if we lose our beautiful places, my children will not get to see the big old forest that I saw when I was young. And that thought breaks my heart, but it also gives us the will to fight them. And it's just that. This fight has required many sacrifices, not just in time and effort, but in blood. And for a long time, we used to hide in the forest at night with a notebook and a flashlight. If the group of illegal loggers was large enough, we would simply hide in the darkness, take notes on their numbers. However, if the group is small enough, we can sometimes trick them into thinking that we are more in numbers, at which point they will abandon their lumber, jump into their trucks, and drive away. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes the loggers go on the attack and will rush us with their chainsaws and axes at the ready. And believe me, you have not seen your life flash before your eyes like you will when a man with a revving chainsaw is running at you full speed. It's a horror that I'm never likely to forget. Now, we call the police when this happens, but they are stationed far from the forest and only ever arrive too late to do anything about the loggers. Now, for the most part, us foresters tried our best to stop the logging, and we also tried to root out those of us who have been taking bribes. We tried very hard, but we were mostly unsuccessful in this. And in the end, the government decided to tar us all with the same brush. So one day our boss summoned us all to the headquarters because he'd had an announcement to make. The local government had gotten sick of us failing to adequately deal with the problems of the loggers, and after learning of a few isolated cases of foresters taking bribes, they decided that we all had been corrupt. Our protests fell on deaf ears as the government had already decided what they were going to do. If we weren't going to root out those taking bribes, then we would all have to pay for the lost lumber. Thousands of liu, our national currency, would be taken from our collective paychecks every single week, and the longer we failed to deal with the problem, the longer the deductions would continue. We were furious, absolutely furious, but this was also at a time when we had but two options to choose from: work as agreed and lose out on pay, or quit and face the possibility of not being able to put food on our families' tables. And for some of the younger foresters, it was a tough choice. But for those of us with families, we had only one option: ramp up our efforts to rid the forest of those loggers, no matter what the physical or spiritual cost. And at this stage, we were still not permitted to carry guns around the park, so we had to think creatively to scare off the loggers. And at first we used firecrackers, very large and powerful ones that we could launch through the trees from a distance. These would explode over the loggers' heads and terrified them when they were working in the darkness. But then after a while, they learned not to be bothered by them and would just carry on until we ran out of fireworks to launch. And after that, we tried bringing dogs to scare the loggers, but they called our bluff as we weren't willing to risk the safety of our loyal furried friends, so we didn't sick them on the loggers anymore. And all the while, we petitioned the government to allow us to carry guns with which to defend ourselves, but at each turn, we were told the same thing over and over: you're not soldiers, you're not police, and it's too dangerous. In the end, we were told to focus on intel gathering in the hopes that we would turn over what we found to the police and have them arrest the loggers in their homes. But this was a very slow process, and as we began to lose money, we began taking risks. For months, we found ourselves fighting a losing battle, and then finally a small victory gave us a massive boost of morale. Two of the foresters, Niku and Gavril, were out on patrol one night when they found a group of loggers. There were a lot of them and only two of our foresters, but then instead of simply observing them and taking notes, Niku and Gavril hatched a plan. And this was at a time when, if one lone forester confronted the loggers would just simply chase them away with their axes and chainsaws. And so when Niku began shouting at them and walking straight over to them with his flashlight switched on, some of the loggers stopped their cutting and began walking towards him. And there was shouting of all kinds of curses, making a big scene, and although not all of the loggers went to chase Niku away, it caused enough of a scene to draw the attention of those who remained behind. meaning no one saw Gavel sneak up to their truck and stab holes in 3 of its 4 tires. No one saw him sneaking up, and no one saw him sneaking away. And then the next morning, a second pair of foresters found the illegal logger's truck abandoned with those 3 flat tires. We were elated, and we celebrated the abandoned truck like we had just won a battle in some great war. We were able to sell the illegally harvested lumber to recoup the forest's losses and plant many new trees, and we also had a new and effective way of fighting the loggers, and that brought our spirits up an incredible amount. But sadly, it didn't even last a month, because just a few weeks later, little Pavel was out patrolling on his own in a section of forest that we didn't think was of any interest to the loggers, and we found out that we were wrong. It was the middle of the night when we got a call from Pavel saying that the loggers were trying to outsmart us by logging where we didn't expect them to. He said there were lots of them too, 2 trucks worth, so he needed backup to try and scare them off or distract them enough to get a knife into the truck's tires. Those of us that were on duty and could access a vehicle rushed to Pavel's aid. We were hopeful, knowing that we could stop those loggers if we could only get a man near the trucks. But then as we all rushed to Pavel's position, he started talking over his radio again. He said the trucks had almost finished loading up and that the loggers were preparing to leave. We told him not to do anything alone, but after that, he stopped responding on his radio. I panicked, and so did everyone else who heard the radio so quiet. Then, when I arrived at the scene, only my fellow foresters were present and the loggers had disappeared entirely. But to our worry, so had Pavel. And we spent the rest of the night searching for him, walking in pairs with our flashlights and calling out his name. We searched for miles around, but when daylight finally came, he turned out to be no more than 100 yards from where we were first standing. We all knew that he had been found, and we all knew the search had come to an end, because we heard a man screaming like his sanity was slipping away. He had found Pavel, and they had chopped and sawed him to pieces. It was without a doubt the worst crime I had ever had the misfortune of laying eyes on, and in my time as a forester, I had seen a number of very grisly murders and very gory accidents, but not one of them, not even the prostitute who was found broken in half and shoved into the cavity of a tree, managed to horrify me as much as seeing Pavel in pieces. It affected everyone terribly, and many of us went to Pavel's funeral to console his mother with how brave he'd been. I wouldn't say his sacrifice was worth it, because we should have been given weapons long before Pavel lost his life, but his death prompted our bosses to enter into serious talks with local politicians who relented and allowed us to carry rifles. We're not allowed to open fire unless we're directly threatened, but seeing us with rifles was all it took to scare the loggers into going someplace else. We put a brass plaque up at the HQ to honor Pavel's sacrifice, and it's a reminder to new foresters that they are lucky to be a part of a new generation who are allowed to defend themselves. We still face danger, and illegal logging hasn't stopped entirely, but now, no one will ever suffer the same fate as poor Pavel, who died while protecting the forest from human greed. I've worked for the Forest Service for the past 15 years or so, and it's a job that comes with a set of pretty unique challenges in terms of law enforcement. And one of the biggest problems we face is that of illegal hunting. No matter how flexible we are, and no matter how much prior warning we give the local hunting community, there are still those who seek to bypass the law in order to bag themselves a buck at a season. It's probably one of the most infuriating things we deal with too, because if everyone acted like the out-of-season hunters, there'd be far fewer deer and other animals to hunt in season, and it might well contribute to a population spiral among the local fauna. And they acted like the rules shouldn't apply to them, and they give you the worst excuses. Like one guy swore on all he held dear that he thought it was still September. I mean, he'd have to be a moron to forget what month it was, and he'd have to have pegged me for even more of an idiot to believe an excuse like that. Needless to say, we take illegal hunting very seriously. So when we get reports that they're operating out there, putting the animal population in danger, you can bet your bottom dollar that we act on them. So one day, when I got word that some illegal hunting might have been taking place in a particular area of the forest, I drove over immediately to check it out. Now, one of the techniques we use to identify illegal hunting is examining tree trunks in the suspect area. Now, be it a fresh scar in the bark, a small puncture buried beneath new growth, or the piece of metal detected just under the surface, there are many ways to tell if a rifle or shotgun had recently been fired in a certain location. A bullet lodged at a certain height can tell investigators not only where a hunter stood when taking a shot, but also the direction the shot was fired, and we can also use the frequency of said damage to determine if it's a place poachers use as a regular spot. If the trajectory of the shot lines up with the habitat of a protected species, it might even help officers build a case involving the killing of said protected species. And in light of that, us rangers sometimes use metal detectors to locate lead or steel hidden beneath a tree's bark, or, in serious cases, bullets may be removed for ballistic testing. A cartridge dug out of a tree can link a crime scene to a specific firearm just as it might in traditional criminal investigation. Logging companies also have a large vested interest in this because when their saws hit metal buried in wood, the blades can be ruined and operators can be severely wounded, sometimes even killed. In fact, a lot of the reports that we get come from sawmills, who alert the authorities to places where gunfire into trees happens frequently. In this way, trees can serve as a sort of silent witness. Long after an illegal shot had been fired, the evidence may still be lodged there, right inside the wood. So, after getting the report and driving over to the area in question, I grabbed a handheld metal detector from my truck and then went walking through the trees looking for any sign of gunshot damage. Sometimes buckshot damage looks like scratching from deer antlers, which they do remove velvet and mark territory, so sometimes you'll run the detector over a suspected patch of bark only to get nothing. But then after walking for maybe half a mile, I saw some pretty glaring evidence of shotgun damage to a tree. Now, it was a clear example of buckshot damage, one of the clearest I'd ever seen, so I had no doubt whatsoever what had caused the damage. But when I ran the detector over the stop, it just stayed silent. This was obviously very confusing because even the smartest illegal hunter doesn't bother to go digging into tree trunks to retrieve tiny pieces of metal, and from what I could tell from the naked eye, there was a lot of it stuck in that tree. So much so that it might have even come from multiple shots. I pulled out the small knife that I carry with me at times and then started to carefully pull away some of the bark around the affected area. Now, once again, it was quite clearly some ballistic damage because of the obvious tunneling, but when I got to the bottom of one tunnel, it wasn't a fragment of dull metal that I saw, but a kind of off-white, almost porcelain-looking substance. I'd never seen anything like it in my life, and I've been working for the Forest Service for almost 10 years by that point, so naturally, I was very focused to get to the bottom of it. I used my knife to scrape away some of the wood so I could dislodge the small off-white clump, but then after very carefully extracting it from the tree and examining it up close, I was so shocked that I remember letting out a gasp as I almost dropped it. It wasn't a piece of buckshot. It wasn't a bullet. It was a tooth, and from what I could tell, it was a human tooth. As a ranger, you learn to identify the teeth and/or bones of all the various animals that call the park home. Birds are probably the easiest to identify, and then deer teeth are pretty easy seeing as how flat they are. And the same applies to carnivore teeth too, as their distinct shape makes them very easy to identify. And so when I pulled what was quite clearly a front tooth out of that tree, there was no doubt in my mind that it was holding a person's tooth, and not an animal's. Now, we might be forest rangers, but we're still law enforcement, and we're charged with all of the same duties as regular police officers. So when I found that tooth, my first thought following the initial shock was, I need to preserve the rest of the evidence. I walked back to my truck, called in what I'd found over the radio, and then made my way back to the damaged tree to string a bunch of crime scene tape around the surrounding undamaged trees. One of my coworkers was on scene within the hour, and when I showed them what I'd found, they also admitted to finding it incredibly scary. We also felt kind of powerless because I'd say 90% of stuff that goes on in the forest stays in-house, so to speak, as in we deal with it ourselves. But something as bizarre and unexpected as teeth being buried in a tree would require a team of crime scene technicians, possibly even a forensic anthropologist, since we didn't even know how old they were and how long they'd been stuck in that tree. Now, it took days before a full team was assembled. But then one morning, right at the break of dawn, a whole team of techs and forensic guys and a photographer were all headed towards the taped-up area. Everything was photographed. The tree, the ground around it, and positioning of the damage, as well as a close-up to show the teeth still lodged in the trunk. Only when all that was done did they actually go about removing the rest of the teeth from the tree, and they only did so using tools meant to preserve even the smallest trace of DNA or residue. The team also took samples of the wood too, because the rate of growth can help determine how long the teeth have been there. My coworker and I stood there watching them all morning and then offering any information that they might find useful. The investigators seemed particularly interested in there being any unusual activity in recent weeks, and we said if there had been any, we sure hadn't spotted it. And then after that, it was up to the lab to do their tests, so all we could do was wait patiently to hear back. Obviously, our number one question involved who the teeth belonged to, and so did the lab, and so the very first thing we did was compare them to the dental records of those on the National Missing Persons Registry. Now, unfortunately, they didn't get a match, but they were able to quickly move on to DNA testing, which everyone believed would be more likely to bring up a match. DNA testing doesn't just tell you who something belongs to, it tells who their relatives are too. So even if the lab didn't get a direct match, there was a chance that we'd be able to contact who could fill us in on the whole picture. But there were no matches, none whatsoever. Whoever's teeth were in that tree had no relatives on that system, living or dead. And while that's not entirely out of the question, it was another deeply unsettling little detail that we had to contend with. In the end, we never did find out exactly how those teeth ended up in that tree. All we got were just a list of likely theories. One that's worth mentioning, although it turned out to be false, was the idea one of my coworkers had. He figured that it might be some kind of Native American burial site, so old that a tree actually grew up and brought some of this guy's teeth with it. Now, I mean, there was obviously a chance of foul play and that some poor soul had taken a shotgun blast at close range or something, but if that was the case, there would have been shotgun fragments buried along with it. And as one coworker said, it was almost like someone had loaded up a shotgun shell with human teeth and then just fired them at the tree. Now, this was the one scenario, no matter how unlikely, creeped the ever-living crap out of us thinking about it. In fact, just about the only comfort that we had was the idea that those teeth were old, really old, and that if their owners had suffered at all, at least it hadn't been recent. Something we maybe could have done something about and failed to. But just about the only conclusive thing the lab brought back to us was that the teeth appeared to have been buried in that tree trunk for just over a year at maximum, and that they belonged to a man in his 40s at the time of presumably death. Now that was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that I'd actually been working as a ranger around the time of such a thing happening. The forest is a big place too, and by comparison, our ranger team is little more than a skeleton crew, so it's impossible for us to be everywhere at once. But still, it's a bitter pill to swallow. And they never did find out who those teeth belonged to, and no one could say for sure that it was murder, or that his teeth had ended up in that tree some other way. Now, I try not to think about it because when I did, it made walking among those trees all the more creepier. And even now that I'm retired, I still think about those teeth every so often and wonder how in the world they ended up deep in that tree. I've been a U.S. Forest Ranger for the better part of 3 decades, and in that time, I've heard some mighty tall tales from various hikers and campers. We've had more Bigfoot sightings than I can count, about 20-something UFO encounters, and one guy even swore that he saw Jimmy Hoffa, the union boss who disappeared, hiding out in the barrens and living in an RV. It's not just the reports we receive either, because when certain people find out that I'm a ranger, they sometimes ask me about strange or unexplained encounters that I might have experienced while on duty. I appreciate the question, it's a lot more exciting than the stuff I'm usually asked, but unfortunately, my answers tend to disappoint them. I've never seen any kind of undocumented animals out here, nor have I seen any strange lights hovering in the sky, and the only hairy bipedal growling monsters I've seen stomping through the woods have been my coworkers during early mornings. The only thing that's ever happened that's left me truly disturbed doesn't even make for a good story, I don't think. It doesn't have a beginning, a middle, or an end. It was all just confusion, fear, and unanswered questions, and it started when a ranger named Ron went missing while out on patrol. It was a regular morning, and Ron was out performing a fire management inspection when he suddenly stopped responding to radio calls. A ranger drove out to his last known location where he found Ron's truck abandoned and his radio sitting on the passenger seat. A brief search of the area surrounding the truck yielded nothing, so by that late evening, we had state search and rescue guys out there, walking the woods with their sniffing dogs. And it turned out to be a relatively simple process of letting the dogs lead us to him, and after letting them sniff around Ron's truck for a little bit, we expected Ron to be injured in some way, as there were few other reasons why he'd just drop out of contact like that. But when we found him, it was way worse than we thought. Ron was cold, and he looked to be suffering some kind of allergic reaction. I had a cousin that was allergic to peanuts, and Ron looked and sounded exactly like my cousin did when he accidentally ate something with peanut brittle in it one Halloween. Only, it wasn't just Ron's face and neck that looked incredibly swollen. It was his arms and hands, too. They were this sort of deep pink, and the skin was so stretched and taut that it looked almost shiny. The same reddy pink discoloration was consistent all along his arms and hands, but around his fingertips, the skin had become so dark it was almost black. Now, we had a medic with us, so she rushed into action as soon as we found him. She cleared Ron's airway, put an IV in his arm, and then an ATV with a transport cot showed up to take him back to the headquarters. And from there, he was airlifted to a hospital, and by the time he was in that chopper being lifted up into the air, we were a mess. We had no idea what had happened to him out there, and what he'd done or what he'd found. Instead, just about the only thing we did know was that there was a good chance Ron wasn't going to make it. The medics who treated him looked panicked as they tried to figure out what was wrong with him, and one of them even told us straight that it wasn't looking good for him. One of the rangers, a lady named Susie, was in tears by the time we sat down in HQ again. We thought about Ron's wife and kids and how worried they must be, and it just tore us up. Over the next few days, we stayed in almost constant contact with the hospital, awaiting word of any change at all in Ron's condition. Then thankfully, our prayers were answered, and around 72 hours after he was admitted, doctors announced that he'd been stabilized and that he'd most likely pull through. A few of us went to pay him a visit and found his wife in a chair at his bedside. We were obviously very happy to see him awake and alert, so it made for an emotional reunion, but there was an elephant in the room. A very large one, too, because each of us were desperately wanting to know what the hell had happened to him. And when we asked, we were incredibly frustrated to hear that, essentially, Ron couldn't really remember what had happened to him. He remembers walking through the woods, looking for buildups of dead wood or dry pine needles when he suddenly spotted what looked to be a piece of black volcanic rock lying on the ground. It looked very out of place in a forest with no major deposits of that kind of stuff, and so assuming it had been dropped by a hiker, Ron walked over to it and picked it up. He said nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. It felt kind of light, much like a lot of volcanic rocks, but then as he was walking with it, it started to feel very warm in his hands. This was one of the last things he remembered, as he dropped the rock, knowing that whatever was happening, it probably wasn't good for him. And he then said that looking at it just lying there on the ground was when his memory started to get very hazy. He remembered the swelling feeling, and he remembered not being able to breathe properly, but after that, there was just darkness until he woke up in a hospital bed with all those tubes sticking out of him. Now, after a couple of their agents came to talk to him, Ron directed the EPA towards where he'd been patrolling, and they sent a couple of guys over to look for the rock he'd found. At first, doctors were afraid that it had been radioactive, and that Ron was suffering from some kind of acute radiation sickness. They were able to rule that out very quickly thanks to the technology they had at hand, but that only allowed them to rule out one of many possible explanations, and in order to save his life, they needed that list to get much shorter, much quicker. The medical team tried everything, but only managed to reduce the severity of Ron's condition and not alleviate it entirely, and that at some point, right around hour 60, Ron's condition began to stabilize, seemingly on its own, after which his prognosis improved dramatically. And by the time we visited, the doctors were safely able to rule out any kind of allergic reaction. But obviously they wouldn't be able to figure out exactly what had happened to Ron until the EPA was able to recover the rock that he touched. Only, this is where things get weird because the EPA guy couldn't find any trace of any such a volcanic rock anywhere. Now, they walked over the grid squares that Ron had given them, and this was solid info because we had a digital record of where he'd been headed that morning. But after combing through the undergrowth with a fine-toothed comb for hours and hours on end, they didn't manage to find a single piece of rock fitting the description that Ron had given them. They obviously didn't want a hazardous or toxic substance getting into someone else's hand, so they tried their damnedest to find it. But they couldn't, and that scared us. Having something like that around the forest quite obviously posed a danger to the public. Now, we tried our best to warn visitors not to pick up any strange rocks and to report anything unusual directly to the Forest Service office. We were terrified the same thing would happen to a curious hiker or, God forbid, a child. But nothing ever did, and it was like that little piece of warm rock had just disappeared from the face of the earth. And without it, there was no way that we'd ever definitively find out what had happened to Ron. Ron did get better, but he never did come back to work, and he ended up getting a job working with his brother in some home renovations. It was good money, but Ron loved being a ranger, so we knew something really must have frightened him to want to throw in the towel altogether. I can't say it's kept me up at night. It's all long in the past, but I still sometimes catch myself wondering just what the hell